Rwanda, members of the Diplomatic Corps, the Chief of Defense Staff, Rwanda Defense Force, heads of security organs, Rwanda National Police, NISS, Rwanda Investigation Bureau, Rwanda Correction Services, service chiefs, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Rwanda, the Commandant of the RDF Command and Staff College, Commandants of Senior Command and Staff Colleges on the African continent, distinguished guests, moderators, and panelists of this symposium, general officers, senior officers, faculty staff, students of Senior Command and Staff course. Good morning to you all, and welcome to the 11th Security Symposium on a revolving theme, Contemporary Security Challenges on the African Continent. I'm Brigadier General Ronald Rwivanga, your Master of Ceremonies for this event. I would like to first of all welcome our guests who have come from different parts of the continent and beyond to participate with us in this symposium. Thank you very much for honoring this event with your presence. The National Security Symposium is an annual event organized by the RDF Command and Staff College in conjunction with the University of Rwanda. It brings together high-level government officials, policymakers, security practitioners, renowned academics, and scholars in security studies from all over the African continent and beyond to find practical, plausible solutions to contemporary security challenges. This is a unique forum that hugely benefits our student officers who are in their final phase of the one-year Senior Military Leaders course. These discussions also provide a pool of solutions from which to derive action plans for our security practitioners and researchers. So thank you very much for being part of this very important event. Guest of honor, sir, permit me to briefly go through the program of this three-day security symposium. The program will cover a total of 6 sessions in 3 days. Today we will have 2 sessions and 2 sessions each in the subsequent days. We will start shortly with the official opening ceremony, which will include remarks by our Minister of Defense, who is the guest of honor. We will then be guided to a group photo by our protocol team. This will be followed by a short tea break. After tea break, we will have our first session, and all the moderators will take charge. I will only be coming in to introduce the moderators. So after the tea break, we'll have indeed the first session, and I would like to explain to you how this will go. The moderators will invite panelists to the podium after reading their short CVs, and they will be prompted to discuss their respective topics. This will be followed by a 10-minute wrap-up by the moderator before opening up to the audience to ask relevant questions. This will be followed by a lunch break, and then the day's sessions will end at around 16:15 in the afternoon. The moderators that are indicated in each of your booklets will guide us through all the sessions of the symposium. Without further ado, I would like to invite the Honorable Minister of Defense to give his opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Members of the Diplomatic Corps, the Chief of Defense of Rwanda Defense Force, heads of security organs, Rwanda National Police, NISS, Rwanda Investigation Bureau, Rwanda Correction Service, service chiefs, the Vice Chancellor, University of Rwanda, the Commandant, Rwanda Defense Command and Staff College, commandants of Command and Staff Colleges from Africa, panelists, moderators, invited generals and senior officers, faculty staff, students of the Senior Command and Staff College, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. Good morning. It is an honor and a privilege for me to welcome all of you to the 11th edition of the National Security Symposium. Let me first extend a warm welcome to our guests who have come from all over Africa and beyond to participate in this symposium. This is a clear indication of the importance that all of us attach to collaborative efforts in finding strategies to effectively address the security challenges that confront our world and our continent. This year's symposium is organized at a time Rwanda is commemorating 30 years of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. One of the hallmarks of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi was that the international community largely ignored it. The major powers at the United Nations even discouraged international intervention, while the international media perverted it. Rwanda's worldview cannot be explained without reference to this tragic experience. As Rwandans, we have learned indelible lessons. I wish I could say that as international community, we have learned lessons too. On the contrary, year by year, we move further away from the goal of creating a peaceful world. Distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, as we gather here today, our world is confronted with a myriad of security challenges that threaten peace and stability. In fact, our world is facing existential challenges and edging towards brinkmanship. These challenges range from terrorism, youth radicalization, and violent extremism to cyber threat through governance failures, climate change, global energy disruptions, food insecurity, unfair trade and financial systems, to mention but a few. Allow me to elaborate a bit on some of these challenges. On the one hand, the global governance in its present form entrenches divisions and fuels discontent. We must work based on justice with renewed urgency and solidarity. There is an opportunity to create a more inclusive, comprehensive, and effective global order that works for everyone. On the other hand, the climate crisis is gathering pace. The next few years ought to be decisive. We have the tools, we know what to do, and we have nobody to blame. Moreover, despite hopes that the world will emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic and food security would begin to improve, world hunger has continued to increase across and within countries. Furthermore, the energy markets continue to experience recurrent disruptions. The energy crisis has taught us that the energy transition process will have disruptive effects through supply shocks, rising energy demand, and ultimately rising prices. Finally, today's global economy and financial architecture based on frameworks agreed nearly 8 years ago is outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. We need a global economy and finance systems that work for everyone, everywhere. Distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, all these challenges put together remind the world, more particularly our continent, that the need to look for solutions to address the complex and ever-changing security landscapes has become more urgent than ever. This requires a collective effort from various stakeholders, including government, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector. This National Security Symposium brings together experts, policymakers, and other stakeholders to discuss and identify solutions to these pressing security issues. It offers a golden opportunity to engage in fruitful discussions, analyze current trends, share best practices, and collaborate on innovative approaches to address the multifaceted security challenges facing our continent today and build a more secure and sustainable future for all. I am confident that the diverse expertise and perspectives represented in this symposium will enrich our discussions and contribute to the development of innovative strategies to enhance the much-needed peace and security on our continent. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, I would like to take this opportunity to express my deepest appreciation to the Rwanda Defense Chief of Defense Staff, the Rwanda Defense Force Command and Staff College Administration, and the University of Rwanda for putting together such a comprehensive agenda for this important gathering. A big thank you also to all our guests, panelists, moderators, and participants. Let us make the most of this opportunity to discuss, exchange ideas, generate innovative solutions, and work towards generating a different narrative for our continent. Distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, it is now my singular honor to declare the National Security Symposium 2024 officially open. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister of Defense, for your remarks. The next item on the program is the group photo, which will include 2 VIP photos, along with students of senior command and staff course. The first VIP and student group will include the Minister of Defense, the CDS, service chiefs, heads of security organs, the commandant of the senior command and staff course, the University of Rwanda Vice Chancellor, along with the students and faculty. The second VIP photo will include, again, the Minister of Defense, the CDS, the commandant, the Vice Chancellor of University of Rwanda, commandants of allied command and staff colleges, commandants of GACO, Gabiro, and NASHO, of course, along with students and faculty. Other participants will be guided to the tea area to be joined by the photo group. Protocol will guide VIPs to the photo area. Thank you very much.
Hakaba hamaze gutangizwa inama nkuru yiga ku mutekano National Security Symposium. Ni inama itangijwe ku mugaragaro na Minisitiri w'Ingabo Juvenal Marizamunda, aho mu byo yagaragaje bizanibandwaho muri iyi nama ari ukwiga ku bibazo by'umutekano yaba ibyugarije umugabane wa Afurika, cyane ko iyi nama ije mu gihe umugabane wa Afurika umaze imyaka myinshi wibasiwe n'ibibazo by'umutekano muke, intambara ndetse n'ikibazo cy'iterabwoba muri rusange. Ni inama isanzwe yitegurwa n'ishuri rikuru rya gisirikare rya Nyakinama National Command and Staff College, rikaba ari n'inama isanzwe yitegurwa ku bufatanye na RDF, akaba ari nabo bari mu bazibanda ku biganiro bizagarukaho muri iyi nama. Mu byo binateganijwe muri iyi nama harimo kwibanda ku mutekano by'umwihariko w'akarere ndetse n'umugabane wa Afurika, ariko by'umwihariko hakanagarukwaho ku cyateza imbere umugabane wa Afurika, ku cyateza imbere abaturage, ndetse hibandwa cyane cyane ku guteza imbere umutekano wabo muri rusange. Mu bigarukaho muri iyi nama iteraniye i Kigali mu gihe cy'iminsi 3, ni uko hazanagarukaho ku bibazo by'umutekano wibasiye umugabane wa Afurika muri rusange. Ndetse mu bindi biteganyijwe muri iyi nama izarangira ku munsi wo kuwa gatanu,
and given the task of moderating this first session. I want to start with something that stood out to me for this topic. Sub-Saharan Africa has become the global epicenter of violent extremism activity. Now, ladies and gentlemen, just let that sink in, that this part of the world has become the center of global extremism. That statement came from a 2023 report from UNDP, which found that in 2021, almost half of all terrorism-related deaths were in sub-Saharan Africa. More than a third were in just 4 countries: Somalia, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. This has, of course, spread to other countries. For instance, we've seen in Mozambique, as far down south. And all are having a huge impact on lives, livelihoods, and prospects for peace and development. Now, as if that wasn't enough, the radicalization of youth, fueled by social and economic disparities, presents a significant security threat that must be addressed. The figures on youth tell the story. Most data indicates that more than 60% of the total population of Africa is made up of the youth. If we take this country, Rwanda, nearly 80% of the population is under 35. 72 million African youth are not in education, employment, or training. You can see the potential for youth radicalization. This is one of the most pressing challenges facing the African continent today. And we will try in this session to not only look at some of the causes, but more importantly, how to counter this youth radicalization and its connection to international violent extremism. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a stellar panel to address this most important of topics that we're starting this 12th conference with. And we have a stellar panel and who are now going to join me on stage. I'll just read them out and say a few things about them. First and foremost, from Rwanda, we have Major General Joseph Nzabamuita. Where is he? I think he should be around. You're right. Okay, sure. Okay, fine. And the Major General is the Secretary General of the National Intelligence and Security Services, and he's done this since 2016. Before his appointment, he served as Director General of Policy and Strategy at the Ministry of Defense. He also worked as the Military and Defense Spokesperson, a position he held since July 2011. Prior to that, General Nzabamuita has served as Rwanda's Defense and Military Attaché in Washington, D.C., and from March 2003 to March 2006, that's when he was based in Washington. We have Nikolai Mladenov, Director General of the Anwar Gargish Diplomatic Academy based in Abu Dhabi. He serves as the Director of Research and Analysis Department. He has served as the Director there since 2021. His Excellency, he has been in the past the UN Secretary General Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and envoy to the Middle East Quartet between 2015 and 2020. For more than a decade, he was active in Bulgarian politics. He was also a member of the European Parliament from 2007 to 2009. And he was involved in a number of EU election observation missions, especially one to Ghana in 2008. Our next panelist is Tolu Akerere, who's really a specialist on sort of research, consultancy, and on defense and issues on sub-Sahara Africa. She maintains an active interest in sub-Saharan African security through actively working for both public and private sector institutions. This ranges from ad hoc security interviews on the Sahelian affairs to research papers for the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Trends in Islamic ideology, security policy briefs to the Nigerian Army's Research Center, and most recently, a presentation and panel discussion for NATO's COE-DAT. Dr. Afzal Ashraf has worked in the military, government, academia, policy strategy, counterterrorism, and he's a counterterrorism practitioner. I was about to ask him actually what it is he hasn't done. In addition to his advisory roles, he has delivered the national and international policies and strategy. And he has worked in the UK on the national security structures that led on the special political communication narrative analysis and counter-narrative construction tasks. Previously in the Royal Air Force, he was the head of training management, and he continued in the field of education in a couple of the UK's top universities. That's the panel we have, and we're going to, later on, sitting also in the audience, who will join the discussion once the presentations are done, will be Dr. Zenebi Bayene, who is an associate professor and coordinator of the international programs in the School of Journalism and New Media at the University of Mississippi. He specializes in media in conflict and post-conflict societies. So he'll be joining us to make his remarks towards the end. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel. So to start us off, I'm going to ask Tolu Akerere, how we're going to run this today is that we're going to have presentations and remarks from each of the panelists as they come up, as they start. After which, there may be one or two questions I might throw at them, and then the next panelist will come on, basically all addressing this particular topic. And of course, then Dr. Bayene will make his remarks at the end before we open up the session for questioning. And so the idea is that hopefully you will have had a comprehensive look right across the board as laid out by the panelists. So without further ado, Tolu, and your presentation, please, to kick us off this morning.
Thank you very much. Honorable Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Tolu Akerele, and it is a privilege to be here today to discuss this very important topic of youth radicalization and the effects on African insecurity. So in order to first open up this topic, we have to look at counter-violent extremism and radicalization waves. And I'll be doing this through the following themes. First, we need to look at how it works, who's doing the radicalization, who are the targets, AKA who's the target audience, what the implication of social networks and the internet is on self-radicalization and the growth of this trend, and also the role of religious leaders and institutions, particularly in radicalizing and resisting radicalization. So defining radicalization, the European Commission quotes as being a phased and complex process in which an individual or group embraces a radical ideology or belief that uses, accepts, and or condones violence, including acts of terrorism. And this is done in order to reach a specific political or ideological purpose, such as the establishment of an Islamic caliphate. But it's very important when understanding radicalism to differentiate the nuances between Islamic fundamentalists and radical Islamists. So Islamic fundamentalists seek a return to Islamic values and Islamic laws, such as Sharia law, in face of Western modernization. Whereas the second group, radical Islamists, are actually seeking to bring about change through violent means and radical changes. However, should Islamic fundamentalists choose to adopt extremist views and bring about change through violence, they can be deemed as radical Islamists. So let's look at the breeding ground and some of the contributing socioeconomic factors to radicalization. So, as our moderator very eloquently put it, the Sahel is the most terror-affected region in the world. And in fact, there's been a 2,000% increase in terrorism in the last 15 years. And according to the Global Terrorism Index of 2022, there's been a 43% of all global terrorism deaths occur in the Sahel. So you can see from this map that the Sahel stretches from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Red Sea in the east. And while we have debunked this theory of poverty being a driver for radicalization, it is definitely linked. So we see a disillusionment with the existing political systems. We see a disenfranchised youth. We also see political disillusionment and the Islamicization of politics, because in Nigeria, for example, northern Nigeria, Sharia law was introduced in 1999 in all northern Nigerian states. Now, this was done as a political ploy in order to seek re-election, etc. But what we saw was that those political elites in northern Nigeria didn't live their lives in accordance with Sharia law themselves. So again, the wealth of those in power in a lot of these African countries against the backdrop of lacking basic services, healthcare, lacking infrastructure, all of this leaves a youth that feels neglected and also deceived by their political leaders. So there's this perception of hypocrisy, and particularly in post-independent countries following colonialism, this rise in secularism and towards secularism has contributed to the growth of radical Islam. So we have a brilliant youth across the African continent who is driven and has a desire to do something with their lives. And this desire to bring about change or to be impactful is seen as low-hanging fruit by radical extremists. So they give this youth something to do. Other permissive conditions that contribute to the rise in radical extremism on the continent is this history of authoritarianism. And we see sub-Saharan Africa, particularly the north and west of Africa, is very susceptible to radicalization. So this history of authoritarianism plays a key role in radical movements through this cycle of repression and radicalization. We see age-old violations of civil and political rights, and the repression of opposition forces. So this steers a population towards radical thinking. Terrorist groups then flourish in the ungoverned space left by runaway governments. And of course, we have what we consider porous borders, but of course, these borders are simply lines that have been drawn in the sand that have no regard for the cultural and ethnic groups that share similarities across the borders. So we see stateless areas with less resistance, like Mali or Niger, becoming safe havens for radical extremists who use quasi-ethical claims to justify and recruit. So under the umbrella of misappropriated jihad, there's a call to, fight this holy war against the oppressors, whether it's the West, whether it's the incumbent government. I'll expand on that in subsequent slides. So it's important to understand there is an international component to this. So as I mentioned, a lot of countries post-independence saw a decline of traditional Islamic organizations and a collective local Islamic identity, which has led to a rise in extremist groups. Now, terrorist groups exploit this concept of a near and far enemy as propaganda, and this leads to an increase of self-radicalization of a disenfranchised youth. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's a quote from the former emir of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Abdelmalek Tokdel, who said, "We seek to liberate the Islamic Maghreb from the sons of France and Spain, and employment for the outsiders, and protect it from the foreign greed and the Crusaders' hegemony." Now, these are very strong words: liberate, foreign greed. So again, there's this concept of the far enemy, whether it's the West or France or what have you, on near enemy soil, which is again the regional governments. So the recent expulsion of France from some of these Sahelian countries has led to some kind of vindication, furthers this propaganda of expel the enemy. And France has now been replaced by the Russian Wagner Group. So again, this feeds into the narrative of fighting to reclaim their sovereignty, fighting for an Islamic state, etc. So as you can see here at the bottom of the slide, we have a large presence of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda that have their affiliated entities across the continent, whether it's Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, Mali, Sudan, the Lake Chad Basin. You can see all of these groups, and they have cemented themselves through digital propaganda and governance. And when we look at extremist migration waves, we also have to consider foreign fighters in the context of neighboring countries. So Dabiq is the Islamic State's, well, it was the English-speaking propaganda magazine. And in 2015, they had a call for those who could not join the fight or who have been prevented from emigrating to Iraq, Syria, etc., to join the fight in Africa. By Allah's permission, come, O Muslims, to your state, for we call on you to mobilize for jihad and incite you and invite you to emigrate to your brothers in West Africa. So again, as far back as 2015, there was this call to join a collective, a brotherhood. And the language that's adopted here, O Muslims, mobilize for jihad. So it's a very strong language. So I'm going to delve into some more recruitment tactics. I mentioned digital propaganda, and the FBI's counterterrorism division in 2014 noticed a significant change in the Islamic State operations. The group published about 100 names and pictures on social media networks, telling its followers to attack and kill any of the people they came across in this list of 100 names and photos. Now again, this is a very strong call to action, and it incentivizes and incites lone wolves, which are notoriously difficult to counter. And again, polarizing international affairs such as Israel-Palestine, or even the Danish cartoon Charlie Hebdo, the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad, all of these things join in the narrative of Islamophobia and global oppression of Muslims. So international affairs and digital propaganda all help drive this background of Muslims being oppressed and the need to fight for the collective brotherhood. Now, it's important to note that online radicalization only complements other means and is often seen as the line of least resistance, again, through this idea of brotherhood. But the other strength in these extremist groups on the continent is how they present themselves as alternatives to government. And they do this by humanitarian assistance. Ansari, which is an Al-Qaeda-affiliated group that broke away from Boko Haram, they've actually been described as a peaceful organization that helps local community members. Similarly, we see how they protect the rural people who are being neglected by the government. Islamic State in the Greater Sahara also resolves land tenancy issues, protects people's cattle from theft. So again, they're seen as providing and protecting the local culture and community by providing membership. And JNIM, which is an Al-Qaeda-affiliated group, actually exploits intercommunal tensions and recruits along ethnic lines, favoring the Fulani group over the Dogon ethnic group. And of course, off the backdrop of disenfranchised youth, poor job economic opportunities, etc., a lot of these groups have started self-funding. That we saw this with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and it's also true for the Islamic State in the West African province, who raises up to $48 million a year on the fish and pepper trade around the Lake Chad Basin. So you can imagine if that kind of money is coming in on an annual basis, how it would incentivize people to join. And some people don't join these groups for religious purposes. Some are just interested in remuneration, which they receive when they join. Again, some are lured by the financial component, access to drugs and women. So this is more just a carnal reason for joining and also being part of a group. The social welfare aspect of distributing food and medicine, and also controlling the local economy, also adds to the attractive lure of these extremist groups. But on the other side of the coin is forcible recruitment. So we see this with the likes of Boko Haram, who recruit young children, child soldiers, ply them with tramadol, and put them on the front lines. And I've spoken to members of the military in Nigeria, and they say that it's extremely difficult to go against an opposition when you're seeing an 8-year-old in front of you. So either you're being killed by an 8-year-old or you choose to kill an 8-year-old soldier. We also see how Boko Haram has used women and children as human bombs. Sex slaves, human trafficking, etc. We're all aware of how Boko Haram kidnaps and takes children from boarding school and again enlists them or has child brides. So there is this notion as if you're not with us, you're against us. Local communities are extorted, territories are seized. If you're a Christian, perhaps your home will be seized and suddenly you have to pay a tax. Because what these groups are doing is they're creating proto-states. And by this, they can then extort the local community. They can say you have to pay a security tax. So again, if you want to stay alive in this area, you now have to pay a levy. There is also a hardliner stance from the likes of the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, where they amputate thieves' feet, etc. So there is a strict regulation of civilian behavior. So I'm going to briefly touch on some of the solutions and how we can collectively de-radicalize. Now, of course, there has to be collaborative thinking. We have to have a solution that's context-specific. There is no one-size-fits-all. There is a very severe fight going on for the hearts and minds as a campaign, and it needs to be countered with asymmetrical warfare. So there needs to be job creation, opportunities for youth to engage the populace, vocational training that will directly result in employment, counter-extremist preaching, modifying cultural narratives to educate the masses and help them be better equipped in face of violent extremism. And while there is a need to focus on community to enhance trust and facilitate information sharing, this is quite difficult given, again, the political background. Now, in terms of religious moderation, there are a lot of things that can be done. In northern Nigeria, we have this system called al-Majiris, where parents send their children to learn about Islam from preachers on the road. But what happens is they end up becoming street beggars, urchins, etc. So instead of abolishing the al-Majiri scheme, perhaps bringing some more structure towards it, having tables and buildings and an actual Islamic education that is not on the streets. Interfaith dialogue. Gender roles play an important role. I taught at some schools in Maiduguri, which again is in northern Nigeria, and the first thing I did was mix the boys and the girls together because the boys were on one side of the room and the girls were on the other side. So again, just having this more integrated approach, engaging traditional leaders. And of course, to build trust within a community is a tall order with the socio-political backdrop. There is a need to build capacity within the Muslim communities, but it needs to start from the understanding that in the West and in non-Muslim majority states, there is a lacking cohesive infrastructure that these states can rely on to solve this problem. And what do I mean by that? So in the West, we see second and third generation immigrants who don't perhaps feel British or they don't feel like they belong there, but they also maybe don't feel like they belong in their Pakistani culture if they've never been there before. So that this leaves them very susceptible and vulnerable to radicalization because they want to become part of a group. They want to feel like they belong. So in a way, we're seeing something similar across the African continent whereby the youth don't feel like they belong. They don't feel like they're heard. They don't feel like they can make any difference. So why not make a difference with an organization that's going to listen to you while you're fighting for a seemingly legitimate cause? So again, governments need to differentiate between helping these Muslim communities build capacity and using those communities for intelligence gathering. And part of this is a bottom-up grassroots approach, which involves preachers, parents, teachers, and street workers, but equipping them with some basic psychological training so they can spot early warning signs and early recognition of radical thought, and counter it with cordiality instead of force and integration. Another approach is legislation. So having this multi-pronged approach from different angles, like Morocco and Saudi Arabia, can help. In the UK, the Terrorism Act of 2015 places a statutory duty on specific authorities to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. One such group is PREVENT, and they have 3 objectives. In the interest of time, I won't go into detail, but perhaps we'll discuss on the panel. But unfortunately, PREVENT is distrusted by a lot of Muslims in the UK because they're seen as simply infiltrating these communities to gather intelligence. So again, this is a reminder to tailor these de-radicalization programs to the cultural, historical, and political circumstances. And of course, in the era of misinformation, internet-based de-radicalization still has a long way to go, particularly when faced with the sheer amounts of propaganda that's being disseminated, and again, of course, with international affairs playing a contributing role. So there's a need to ramp up these critical thinking skills of the populations so they're less vulnerable to radicals. And they'll be able to critically engage with the understanding arguments that support this extremist narrative. And we can do this through well-respected scholars and preachers who will then delegitimize the actions of radicals and refute their theoretical and ideological justifications. In Saudi Arabia, for example, political dialogue was encouraged with prison detainees. And what happened was prisoners were able to debate and discuss with moderate religious scholars. So they could discuss all matters of religious interpretation. What does it mean to have relations with non-Muslims, be it as a friend or otherwise? And this is an approach that should be taken into consideration. Morocco also had a very comprehensive counter-radicalization measure, such as political and religious reform, Through government funding of literature and media, they were able to disseminate moderate religious knowledge. But it is important to err on the side of caution with this because it can be seen as government interference to shape religious messages, which then leads to government criticism, the idea of the near enemy again, and a potential perceived return to authoritarianism. And this again perpetrates that circular propaganda. So while these are some best practices that can be shared, it is very important that we understand one size doesn't fit all, and we will have to tailor the approach and have cross-border collaboration and just hope for a better future by giving youth an opportunity to be heard, having youth in positions of political and influential, impactful means. So thank you very much, and if there are any questions, I look forward to answering them in the panel.
Come back and before we go to, I don't know, I just wanted to ask you a couple of things. Is the intervention of Russia and the displacement of France in the Sahel, is that making a difference?
It is, because while you have the presence of foreign forces, there is this idea that there's a battle for the sovereignty of the people. So once you have the presence of whether it's France, whether it's Russia, whoever it is, that is fighting the extremists can use that to further their narrative of we are under attack as Muslims. We are under attack because we're fighting for an Islamic state. We're fighting for Muslims not being oppressed. So it's almost directly oppressing them. And even though those who understand the true interpretation of Islam can see that this is radical thought, it actually just adds more fuel to the fire because it gives them that perpetual narrative of we are not being respected, we are under attack, we are oppressed. So I think, yes, the presence of these forces adds to the narrative.
Also, the other question I had was that we've seen sort of activity now, for instance, we talked about the Sahel, but we now have sort of, for instance, in Mozambique. So, for instance, you know, is this spreading? Or is it a different type of radicalization that's going on?
Exactly. It's a different type of radicalization because if we take the likes of Senegal, for example, who has a very large Muslim population, they're not struggling with extremism.
No.
So that's why it has to be context specific. What we see in Mozambique is not what we see in Nigeria. What we see in Nigeria is not what we see in Mali. So even though there's similarities in terms of the spread and growth of radicalization, and again, like I mentioned, some of those contributing and permissive conditions that allow extremist thought to thrive and grow, it doesn't always have the same root cause.
Okay, and one more from me, which is that a while back I was working on the Pakistan-Afghan border. And in that area, one of the things that you see is that a lot of the young people sort of go to madrasas. And so their first allegiance, shall we say, is not to the state, but to the religion. Now, where would that fit in your best practice kind of scenario that you gave us here? You know, because I'm sure it could happen in sort of on the African continent as well.
I think the importance is an interfaith dialogue. So even if you have an Islamic-based education, which again, literature, the Quran, there is a lot of value in that. As long as you're not becoming the other or you're separating yourself from other cultural or religious believers, I think it shouldn't really drive or propel radicalization. Two things can be true. You can have Islamic education in madras, you can have a higher education, but as long as you're being exposed to tolerance towards others, it's absolutely fine. I don't see that being an issue. But again, it all depends on what the state is doing. Are there absentee governments? Is there corruption? Is there job opportunity? All these things help and also can be a hindrance. So it's a combination of a lot of other contributing factors, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tolu. And there will be an opportunity for all of you to sort of throw some questions at her a little later on. But I'd like now to call on Major General Joseph Zabamuita to sort of make your remarks. Yeah.
The Chief of Defense Staff, sir, Your Excellencies, Service Chiefs, Heads of Security Organs, our guests, good morning. Let me first of all thank the panel and the first panelist who gave a very good overview of the situation. Mine will be a provocative session so that we should be able to engage into discussions. I thank the college and the RDF leadership for having given me this opportunity, but for organizing this series of National Security Symposium. Today is taking place after 30 years of the genocide against the Tutsi. Rwanda has made remarkable progress, although we are still grappling with the effects of what went through in 1994. And what went through in 1994 actually has a very direct relevance to the topic that we are discussing today. In 1994, we saw a genocidal government that involved the whole society of Rwanda to kill ourselves. We had radicalization, and we had youths that were organized into killing machines, especially the Interahamwe. Today, these very genocidal forces are in existence, and they still pose a threat. Again, we meet today when the world is undergoing tectonic changes. If you look at the global situation today, there's global power, superpower competition. There's no cooperation. It's as if we are actually rewriting a new global order, from unilateralism to multilateralism. So with all these changes, Africa definitely has got to feature somewhere. And how does it feature? It's as if we don't count on the global stage. We are just looked at as a continent where the whole global competition is for resources on the African continent, or we are viewed as a continent whereby there are national security threats to all these other countries, especially from the global north. So where does that leave us as Africans? That's why I indicated that the college, the RDF, organizing this National Security Symposium is very important for us as Africans and also our colleagues that are actually participating. Because at the end of the day, the African continent will continue to play a role on the global scene, whether positively or negatively. To understand today's security challenges, especially this very topic of youth radicalization and violent extremism, we need to reflect back. What are the underlying causes? Why has this continent actually been what it has been? The current issues that we have can just be seen from what Africa has been suffering through for ages. I'll mention just a few of them. Slavery. Slavery and the impact that it made on our continent. We lost a youthful population to the Americas, to Europe, to Middle East. So Africa was denied of its strength, and therefore the impact as we face it today, we need to face it and trace it back in those times. Secondly, colonialism. The impact of colonialism on and destruction of African countries, or rather African peoples, our cultures, our development is still prevalent today. We are still nursing the effect of colonialism. It should not be a pretext to us as Africans, but if we do not look at the colonial legacy, then we are not going to understand the challenges that we are facing today. Third, the mismanagement of post-colonial independence phase on our continent. Whereas we started very well with our Pan-African leaders clamoring for independence, did we achieve our aspirations as independent African states? How did we manage the independence period as to give the Africans their rightful place and their true independence that they looked for? The final one is the current phase where we are facing globalization and the advance of technology. So all these challenges have a huge impact on the African continent, and if not well managed, definitely are causes of what we see today. So, what is the narrative regarding Africa? Several countries, several continents, several regions actually engage in national security discussions, debates. I'll mention just a few of them. For instance, the Munich International Security Conference that takes place in Germany, in Munich, every year around February. It brings together European countries and the US under what is called Transatlantic Alliance. Under those conferences, they are discussing about global threats and how these countries, especially the global north, are able to confront the global challenges and advance their own national security interests. There are some others like the Shanghai, whatever, for the Far East, Russia, China, and whatever. But where do we feature as an African continent to discuss our own national security issues and issues that affect our populations? I've been privileged to attend some of these conferences regularly, and I can assure you there are only a few countries from Africa. Rwanda is always present, and the discussions on the continent are always discussing about the threat the African continent is posing on the global north. And what are these security challenges? Migration, radicalization, extremism, and terrorism on the African continent. And these countries are actually plotting policies on how to confront and contain Africa. So I used to wonder, why should the African continent be labeled the way it is? I'm using the Munich Security Conference as an example. If you go into the academia, if you go into the media landscape, the African continent is always taken as that continent whereby you are either going to get resources or to contain the security threat that is coming from there. How do we contain the Africans? At the end of the day, we as Africans also parrot the same narratives that are being propagated from the north. So it's true there are definitely challenges on the African continent, and my sister highlighted all the issues very well academically. But you ask yourself, which continent does not have these challenges? If you go to Europe and you look at the populism and the advance of political parties and governments that are going towards the far right, looking at petty nationalism, there is no difference between that kind of populism and the way African continent and African governments are actually becoming more tribalistic. But when we are talking about the African continent, we portray it as the worst continent. No, it's not the worst continent. There are very positive aspects on the African continent. It's only that we have not managed to govern ourselves and look at how we address the current challenges and threats, and therefore we engage into the real governance and development of our continent. So, do I blame the global north? Do I blame the developed world? Not at all. I'm just throwing the challenge to us as Africans. Do we love our countries? Do we love our people? Or we hate them? For diplomatic reasons, I'm not going to mention countries because each person is usually very patriotic to his own country. But you consider the status of governance in your own country. Do you fear your population? Do you fear your youth? What is the status of governance in your own country? What programs are there for the development of the country to give the youth hope? We fear our own populations. We fear our own youth. That's why our youth are struggling to migrate to the global north, to Europe. And as I indicated, this is not a problem only from Africa. If you go to Latin America and you look at the migration, the people that move to the United States of America, I think every single year they must be going between 6 and 10 million people that are moving from Latin America to the US. So migration is a big threat to the continent. But why should our youth migrate from Africa to Europe? They risk dying in the Sahara. They are detained in some African countries that are bordering the Mediterranean. And when they go towards, if they don't sink in the Mediterranean Sea, they are put in quasi-prisons even in European countries. So migration becomes a problem. Who is to blame? Let's look at the responsibilities of us as African countries to be able to stop this problem. So if it is not migration, then there is this radicalization. My sister went into all these details. How do we have this radicalization? If you don't have a youth that is educated, that is employed, that has aspirations of a better future, it gives room now for non-governed spaces and yes, the interference from external factors will come towards the radicalization of our youth. How are they radicalized? The issue of religious radicalization, religious extremism. Currently, we are talking about the Islamic radicalization. But Rwanda, historically, the problems that we have faced, we have not only Islamic radicalization has been a small component of it. How about Christian radicalization? Do we ever even discuss about Christian radicalization? On the Rwandan context, we had the problem of colonialism that was actually propagated alongside the white fathers. The Christian, the Catholic entrenchment here on this country has been the source of divide and rule and radicalized our youth. So, when you are talking about religious extremism, let's also put it into context. Yes, there is the current threat of Islamic radicalization, but we should not parrot it from the Western view of radicalization and violent extremism alone. Because Rwanda is an example of what we went through in 1994, the Interahamwe's and the 10 Commandments from the Bible that were used by these extremists are live examples of how this country has been destroyed. the weak and stagnant economies. How have we invested in our economies as the African continent? With all the natural resources of the continent, the multinational corporations that come and invest in these countries are just extractive industries that come, mine, and take all the raw materials, and the valuation, the value chain is done in these Western countries. That's where the employment takes place. So you have not managed your own governance system. We have not managed to govern our economies, and therefore we end up unemployed. Of course, our youth will definitely be attracted to the areas because of even the narrative that has been set. The international media houses are working for the global north or for these developed countries. They portray their countries as the most civilized, the most developed. So our youth are being attracted. At the end of the day, we all become victims of the narratives and the policies that we have set up in place. So how has Rwanda tried to sort out these problems? Number one, Rwanda is not an island. We have a fair share of contribution to the global threats, continental threats, and at the same time try to address our own problems. On the African continent, we have seen how Rwanda has contributed not only to peacekeeping, but also the building of the African security architecture. We have contributed to international peacekeeping. We are currently number 4, biggest troop and police contributing country, but we do not only contribute to these peacekeeping operations, but also bring in new paradigms, including the responsibility to protect the use of our women in police, to address gender violence. And why am I mentioning this? Because even when we address the security challenges that we have, we end up actually contributing to the problem rather than addressing the real problem, because we employ kinetic means without understanding the problem, the root causes of the problem. We end up actually injuring the women and youth, and therefore, because of the mistakes that government interventions take, then we end up actually creating room for recruitment and radicalization of our youth. So by Rwanda's contribution, we bring in Rwanda's lessons learned of what we went through in 1994. So Rwanda's peacekeeping model, modeled both on the multilateral peacekeeping, but also bilateral interventions, and working together with our friendly African countries, governments, examples of Mozambique and Central African Republic, whereby we do not only fight the extremists, the terrorists, but we work with the governments and civil society towards actually the practical de-radicalization process by addressing the real concerns of the population, of the youth, of the women, and therefore the population sees the government intervention as actually an alternative to what the extremists have been preaching to them, that the governments are predators against the population. So this is one of the lessons of Rwanda's contribution. The second contribution, in 2019, when we had a huge population, Rwandan population for sub-Saharan Africa moving towards Europe, many of them dying in the Sahara, some of them being caught up in the Libya situation. Rwanda worked with the African Union, and we agreed that, you know what, other than these African youths, either being in detention centers or mistreated or dying in the Mediterranean, why can't we actually bring them to Rwanda, and then we build a better way of processing these people? Since 2019, we have received thousands of these youth, and work with our Western partners who process relocation to Europe or to Canada, to the US. Even recently, we have seen some going to Australia. So This kind of example, if it can be emulated by several other countries, on top of addressing our own governance problems, our own economic shortfalls, should be able to give another hope to the African youths, but also prevent the radicalization and its impact. Currently, we are in discussion with UK on the UK-Rwanda migration deal. The way it is being portrayed in the media, it's actually as if Rwanda is the one that is in the dock. Yet, the UK approached Rwanda. We said, okay, if you cannot actually host these people, Rwanda would be ready to host them in humane conditions under international law, but you are also going to bear the cost. The UK says, yes, we are going to bear the cost. And what does this cost include? It includes the livelihood of these people, but also the employment of these youth and other professionals that the continent is actually losing to Europe and to UK. So these models, including others like where we are seated today, investment in infrastructure. If our continent has not invested in infrastructure, Rwanda, as a small country, the leadership has decided to invest in infrastructure that are going to be a catalyst for the employment of the youth. Not only do we host the international conferences, but we are now moving towards sports infrastructure whereby you include the hopes of youth, the magnitude of youth that should go into the sports industry, the cultural industry. If you can be able to have this kind of infrastructure, and then you host global sporting events. As we speak, we hold this National Security Conference, we are going to host BAL, the Basketball Africa. Now, if we can bring all the African youth in terms of competitions, in terms of employment, then this is a practical way of actually drawing the youth away from radicalization, from being exposed to these negative tendencies, to the actual aspirations of the youth, and which also end up actually giving employment to the countries, development of our countries, but also an effective way of deterrence. Youth Connect, the current Youth Connect, whereby we want to bring all our youth, African youth, together. We discuss our own problems. We promote civic and socio-economic development. Then we have several other programs, Rwandan Youth Volunteers, Arts Hands, investment in the culture, Youth Connect, and other programs, by even investing in academic infrastructure that should also be relevant to the current job market and the global changes in technology. So I want to end up by commenting about a few things. Recently, just last week, Rwanda hosted CEO Forum. We had several presidents and chief executives from the world, including from the continent. Just seated here on this panel were two people. One was Dangote, Aliko Dangote from Nigeria. He's the richest man on the continent. He was also seated with Patrick Puyo, the CEO of Total. What struck me is that Aliko Dangote said that he needs 35 visas to move on the African continent. 35.
Thank you very much, Major General. Just one question from myself. You talked about, the narrative. Now, can I just ask you, is it not up to Africa to really construct that narrative for itself, instead of worrying about what the US, what the UK says about us? Why is Africa not, having its own narrative?
Absolutely. The onus is on us to build our own narrative as much as the onus is on us to build our own countries and continent. The development of our continent, of our countries, lies with us. And the least where we invest is in the youth. As you, in your opening remarks, the youth make the majority of our continent, in Rwanda. And yet, how much do we invest in our youth? So we need to build our narrative, but how do you build the narrative? You need to build the narrative if you have a program, if you have a policy, if you have governance, you have leadership. And if it is lacking, therefore, the Global North is definitely going to continue building the narrative. And they have never built a positive narrative on the continent, right from slavery, colonialism, post-independence, and even today. If you read any article in any global media, and they talk anything positive on any African country, then there must be a problem with that media, because they must be recruiting that one to be able to devour them. So they build that negative narrative. It is upon us to build a positive narrative by doing the right things and reporting the right things, even investing even in our intelligentsia, our academia, our countries. I told you about how we fear our own people. So we fear them, they migrate to Europe. We fear them, we depopulate ourselves. We fear them, we lose even the skilled personnel that we have, and they go and build these other economies. So we need to build our own narrative.
All right, thank you very much, Major General Joseph. Now, I'd like to call on Director General Nikolai Mladinov. Please, could you sort of make some remarks? And I think you said they won't be too long.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And first of all, let me recognize the Rwandan Armed Forces, the Ministry of Defense, and the government of Rwanda for actually organizing this symposium and for making sure that it starts with a topic that is vital for Africa, and that is the question of youth and radicalization. In Europe, when you talk about the two things together, you usually see them as a threat from the outside. But I firmly believe that in Africa, the fact that African governments, African security services and forces are talking about them first is because there is a growing realization that youth radicalization on the African continent is first and foremost a threat to Africa itself and the African people. I start with this because I want to put what was said in the first presentation in a bit of a broader context. Indeed, the numbers in terms of the threat of terrorism in the Sahel are shifting from the Middle East to the Sahel in terms of the number of people that are killed and the number of incidents. But I want to put that in a bit of a broader context and address a question which was raised also by the Major General, that outside of Africa, the world does not talk about Africa in a positive way. And the reason that that is happening is because the world, particularly in the North, in the global North, fails to see that the future of this century will be written by the people of Africa. By the end of the 21st century, according to the United Nations, the population of sub-Saharan Africa will be 4.5 times larger than China. 4.5 times larger than China. It will be young, it will be dynamic, it will look for opportunities, and yes, you can say that there's a huge risk of radicalization, but yes, you can also say that this is a massive opportunity for Africa's future. The world of the future of this century until the end of the 21st century will not be defined, I'm sorry to say, by the people sitting on this panel, because we are all above the average age group of not just Rwanda, but many other countries in Africa, but by the youth. And they will have to deal with a world that is becoming increasingly complex. Climate, as the Minister of Defense said in his opening remarks, is a challenge that is becoming more and more pertinent to everyone. It is no longer possible to talk about the threat of climate change. We now need to look at how we adapt to the changing climate, how governments will have no choice but to spend more money on adapting to climate change. And this will affect their policies, this will affect their ability to invest in development and invest in the youth. Most recently in the COP28 summit in Dubai, a historic declaration was achieved. And that focused on the link between climate and conflict around the world. And many commitments were made at the COP28 in Dubai, and one of those commitments was to tackle that challenge. But in Africa, on a daily basis, particularly with pastoral communities, we see the link between climate and conflict, and how climate is changing, and that affects both conflict, radicalization, and the prospects for youth. So the world of the future will have a young population that will deal with a complicated climate crisis, but it will also deal with an economy that is very different from the economy to which we are used to today and to which we've been used to in the past few decades. Just between 2010 and 2023, the number of trade barriers between countries has risen from 250 to a staggering 2,500 trade barriers that various countries have put in front of trade to other countries. Now, this ranges from high-tech to agriculture to sanctions to you name it. But the fact is that the world of the future, as of now, will have a much more fragmented economy, an economy that will be much more difficult to navigate. And it will not only be the visa challenge that the Major General spoke about, it will be the challenge of trade. And that challenge, coupled with the increased indebtedness of a number of countries around the world, creates an ever more complicated situation. And finally, to make things worse, the youth of today will have to deal with the have-nots and the haves of artificial intelligence and technology in this century. Because the changes there are so rapid and advancement is so intense that the next division will be not just between the North and the South, between the East or the West. It will be between those who have access to technology, artificial intelligence, and those who do not have access. And the race to that end will be critically defining for the future. Now, in all of this, I think we have also to understand that these are not just threats. This is reality. This is the reality of what we're facing. But in that reality, particularly for the youth of Africa, it is critically important to address how the next generation of leaders is prepared to tackle these challenges. Now, I come from Bulgaria, and yesterday I visited the memorial. And in that memorial, I was struck to realize that at the table on which in 1880, 1878, Rwanda was handed over to Belgium, my country was also split in 5. And in my country, in Southeastern Europe, that led to 5 wars within the 20th century. These 5 wars were devastating, and I hope we have learned through that history that we need to move forward. Just as other parts of the world need to understand that history cannot be undone, but the future needs to be written by us. And looking at the youth of the future, I think it's very important to understand that, not just what are the drivers of radicalization that happen, but what is the environment in which these young communities, particularly in Africa, get radicalized. In 2013-14, I was the UN Secretary General's representative for Iraq. And I saw with my own eyes how the protests that young Iraqis took to the streets because they had legitimate demands were radicalized and taken over by Al-Qaeda. Soon after that, we saw what happened in Mosul with the invasion of the Islamic State, which went through a very systematic process of decimating communities in the north of Iraq, particularly because they were, 1, disenfranchised, 2, impoverished, 3, run by corrupt politicians, 4, they had no participation in their own security, and 5, they were vulnerable to radicalization. These trends that we saw then in Iraq are repeating themselves again and again in the Sahel. And we have no excuse, none of us, politicians, security, diplomats, media, experts, none of us have excuses to say that we are not seeing what is happening now, because the pattern is there, and the pattern can be repeated elsewhere, and it can become even more dangerous than what we've seen in the past decades. There needs to be a focus on education. There needs to be a focus on prisons, which we haven't talked about until now, because prisons are one of the most vibrant environments for radicalizing youth. There's a need to focus on development. There's a need to focus on economic opportunities, issues that have been addressed, but there's also a need to focus on what are still security operations against terror groups that threaten state institutions. So, in fact, if we want to look at how we de-radicalize, how we reduce the risk of radicalization of the youth, we need to look at where the propaganda comes, who are the carriers of these propagandas, who preach it. We need to look at the environment, delivery of services, government delivery of services, opportunities for economic development, but we also need to look at cooperation between African states and others in the fight against terror groups as they emerge. And finally, in closing, one great challenge that we all have to face, and I think this will be a challenge that we will have to come back to throughout this conference, and that is, what is the new narrative that needs to be developed to tackle these challenges? We know the narrative of the extremists. They dehumanize people. They separate them. They make them into killing machines. They feed them propaganda, whether it's religious or other propaganda. They feed it to them, and they make them insensitive to the humanity. But what is the narrative of development and the narrative of the future that we will provide to the next generation to come forward? And as we develop that narrative, whether it is in Africa, in the Middle East, or elsewhere, we need to understand that we will be facing a very, very different world from the world in which we are used to today. And I hope that this event, as well as other events coming after this conference, will contribute to this discussion. Because the more that we think about it today, the better we will be prepared to tackle the challenges of tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mladinov. I just wanted to ask you, you talked about the fact that there's a lack of recognition that the coming period is going to be the African period. Why is that?
First of all, it's because nobody wants to admit that. And secondly, because I think it is far easier to look from the global north to Africa as a sort of threat than as a source of ideas of how you resolve problems. Yet if you look at the details of what is happening in Africa, there are some very, very good examples of what can be done. The Major General spoke about Rwanda quite aptly. There are other examples that you can look at in Africa that are actually good, but that needs to be packaged in a new narrative, in a narrative in which you see more ownership, more African ownership of Africa's debates on the future, whether it's on security policy, economy or anything else. And I think in the multipolar world and towards which we're heading, that discussion will come in a context where you will have more middle powers, if I can use that term, gaining weight in international relations, asserting their presence and their views and their policies, competing with each other in a different way than in the past. And that's why I think, you know, when you look at Africa, all the ingredients to make that are there. They just need to be put together in a meaningful narrative.
So does that mean the new narrative, what you pose a question at the end, which is what is the new narrative going to be? Is that going to be, do you think it should be incorporating the way Africa looks at itself?
Yes.
And then speaks to the
Yes,
world?
I think it should be, but it should be also about how Africa speaks to the rest of the world, not just about itself, but how it speaks to the rest of the world. And I think that, you know, again, there's some good ideas and some good initiatives that have happened and are taking place already, but there's a far greater need of a much more intense dialogue on these issues. It is happening in a way, in a different way, in a different context, in the Middle East, part of the world that I'm far better acquainted with, where you have particularly the countries in the Gulf developing their own capabilities, capacities, diplomatic engagements or networks or alliances, if you wish, that break the traditional mold. Within the last few years, we've seen the emergence of an India, UAE, Israel, US, I2U2 format, which before was very much impossible to think, reaching beyond that, beyond the region, in exactly that attempt to draft a new narrative in which you're the owner of your future far more than the subject of somebody else's policies.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And now I'd like to call on Dr. Afsar Ashraf, who sort of has some remarks he's going to make. So, Dr. Ashraf.
Ministers, Excellencies, Generals, ladies and gentlemen, it's an immense honor to be here today, to be asked to speak to you. One of the problems of being last is that everybody else has eaten my time. And so I'm going to have to speak a little faster and a little more briefly than I would have liked. What we heard are very interesting and important and impressive comments on the use of terrorism and youth radicalization. They're all relevant and detailed expert knowledge. So I want to confine myself to what I would describe as the grand strategic context of terrorism and radicalization. It's what I call the global of terrorism, and that's a word I've made up. And it's a combination of the word global and local. And what that means, I hope I can describe in a book that I've yet to write, which I hope you will buy. But in the brief time that I have, I want to constrain simply the relationship between the local factors, which we have heard described in some considerable detail, and the global politics of the world, how they interact. Let me begin by giving you a very simple and clear message, what we in the UK call the bottom line up front. And that is, African countries need to and should develop their own understanding of what terrorism means, how it originates, and how it is sometimes supported in the interests of global politics. Let me repeat that. African countries need to and should develop their own understanding of what terrorism means and how it originates and how it is sometimes supported in the interests of global politics. Now, these global interests are often run counter to the national and the regional interests of African states with devastating consequences for the lives of ordinary African citizens. Now, this, of course, does not mean that African scholars and experts should stop learning about counterterrorism from Western countries where a great deal of research and study has been carried out. And I'm pleased to see that young African talent such as Ms. Tolu is doing just that. What most military people will know is that tactical success does not lead to success in an outcome of a conflict if the strategic and the grand strategic policy is flawed. And that is the area that I want to discuss, and particularly the thinking that confines the way we think about strategy and the grand strategies involved. I want to briefly explain how understanding of terrorism in Africa has been shaped by its modern origins in the Western world. I will then discuss how terrorism has transformed into an instrument of global politics, and finally, how the study and understanding of terrorism is confined to an increasingly narrow perspective due to the dominance of Western academic and political perspectives. Now, my thoughts are based on a quarter of a century of study and over a decade of counterterrorism policy, strategy, and implementation, and also on field work involving interviewing several dozen Al-Qaeda and ISIS prisoners in Central Asia. In short, the time that I have, I may make some leaps of detail and reasoning, and I hope that you will use the questions to help me fill in any gaps or confusion that I cause. Now, terrorism has always existed in history, but our modern understanding of terrorism in turn comes from the French Revolution, where it was used as a positive sense, as an instrument of state security and subversion. This instrumental use was adopted by anarchists who operated globally even over 100 years ago to fight against the international order of the time. I hope that has a resonance with what we've heard just now. These anarchists carried out several assassinations and acts of violence in Europe, in Asia, and even in the US. They managed to assassinate some US presidents. So from the outside, terrorism has been an instrument of international politics. Its first use as a form of mass murder of civilians occurred before the Second World War, when the Luftwaffe designed aircraft specifically to terrorize civilians by adding sirens to cause screams as they dive-bombed the citizens of Guernica in Spain. Winston Churchill, at the end of the war, described the RAF's policy of bombing as successful terror bombing and admitted that it was presented under a different pretext, in other words, not terrorism. So the label of terrorism was, by then, publicly a negative term, but privately accepted as an instrument of conventional war. And we all know, of course, that the USA used atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to the slaughter of nearly 200,000 innocent civilians in a bid to demonstrate their awesome military might to would-be competitors. Now, nothing can eclipse the horrors of the Holocaust in the Second World War, but I think the use of nuclear weapons in Japan is probably the first case of what I would describe as genocidal terror. In the years immediately following the Second World War, terrorism began to be used as an instrument of anti-colonial warfare, or what was called independence struggles. The Jewish terrorist group, the Irgun, and the Stern Gang carried out bombings and assassinations against British targets, some of which included civilians, such as in the King David hotel in Jerusalem. They successfully managed to achieve British withdrawal from Palestine and speed up the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, you will, of course, know several examples in Africa and in Asia where liberation movements have used terrorism as a means of asymmetric warfare in their attempts to achieve independence. Acts of terrorism by these movements were used by colonial powers as justification for repression and abuse to an extent which frequently eclipsed and exceeded the horrors that were committed by the original acts by the terrorist groups. What happened in East Africa with the Mau Mau at the hands of the British is just one case in point. Therefore, the counterterrorism activity, the label, has also been used by great powers as a pretext for colonial and neo-colonial repression. In certain situations, colonial powers directly or indirectly supported terrorism by one group against another to maintain a national and regional dominance. Nowhere was this horrific, or the outcomes so horrific of this policy and so vividly and painfully demonstrated as in this country in Rwanda 30 years ago. The French pitted the artificially created tribes, artificially created by the Belgians, against each other as a form of colonial control. And as mentioned, I think, in some detail by General Joseph earlier. What started off as terrorism ended up as genocide against the Tutsis. Again, it is not my intention to talk about the genocide, but let me first acknowledge Professor Hazel Cameron in the audience, who has done some impressive research into identifying the French involvement in the atrocities committed on this soil 30 years ago. We should, I note, however, that the link between terrorism and genocide goes back. We saw terrorism as a pretext for the Holocaust by the Nazis, and we see it again linked through allegations of terrorism and genocide in Gaza. The anti-colonial struggle coincided with Cold War, where both sides supported terror groups against each other in the form of proxy warfare. This was particularly the case in South America, Africa, and Asia. I don't have figures, but I think we can confidently assume that millions of innocent lives were lost. They were not important enough to be counted. In the Iran-Contra affair, we realize that this game of global influence and power is not always overt. It is often covert. It is often illegal, even in this case, under American laws, and so secret that even elements of the American government were unaware. Now, there are several effects of this increasing use of covert activity by major states. One is that by hiding their own support for terrorism, the terrorism label is used as a means of discrediting and delegitimizing the other side's case for a just outcome. Another effect is that the states supporting terrorists are labeled state sponsors of terrorism and so delegitimized and discredited in that way. Initially, it was the Soviet Union, and then subsequently other states such as Iran, Russia, Pakistan, North Korea, and occasionally India are some of the states that are labeled as state sponsors. Terrorism has understandably and quite rightly been identified as a threat to humanity, and many states, in fact most states and organizations such as the UN, have cooperated to fight terrorism. It has provided, this cooperation has provided opportunities for global powers to perpetuate their political influence under the guise of developing counterterrorism capabilities. Most African countries lack the capability to counter international terrorist groups, and have consequently taken up offers of support from Western countries to deal with that threat. These arrangements are generally failed, and in some cases have even increased the threat of terrorism. Recently, African states have learned that the armed forces of global powers are primarily an instrument of their foreign policy, and their priorities are dictated by the national interests of those countries rather than the national interest of the countries that they are supporting. As a consequence, many of these forces, in fact, the majority of these forces, are being expelled from African countries. This move underscores the point that I made at the outset, namely that African states need to develop organic approaches and capabilities to fighting the threat of terrorism. An understanding of the global and regional ambitions of global powers within the African continent provides the essential basis for an effective approach. Now, much of what I've discussed is not reflected in Western research. For example, if you look for papers on global terrorism, these invariably discuss the use of terrorism and terrorist groups by what are identified as rogue states, such as Iran, Russia, North Korea, and others. There is very little knowledge of Western nations' involvement in such activities. Now, this is not some form of covert or deliberate censorship in the West. It is largely because the increasing nature of covert support and exploitation of terrorism precludes academic analysis of the realities on the ground. And I will explain how we can overcome that. Another factor is the sense of superiority that we in the West have because we live in a land that gives us the ultimate luxury of freedom of belief, of freedom of speech, and considerable personal, social, and economic security. It is hard for us not to believe that our superior standards of living are not related to our superior standards of thinking and acting. And so we are blinded to our own flaws and to the goodness and talents of others, especially those who live in the African continent. And that is why in the media in the West, you very rarely have any positive news of African governments. And I think, and if I just diverge from my script here, General Joseph made a very passionate plea about the fear that we have, or the Africans have, of their own people. The opposite of fear is faith. And I would like to tell you, General, certainly in my mind, I have considerable faith. And many of my friends are having increasing faith in the goodness of African people. Nowhere in the world's history has countries championed justice above power as African nations are doing. In the case of South Africa, indeed in the case of Nicaragua, taking legal measures rather than violent measures because we didn't have time. Now, we found through this research that there was considerable evidence of a coordinated, well thought out, and consistent methodology of recruitment. This methodology targeted young men from poor families who were either unemployed in their home countries or were, in most cases, operating as guest workers in countries such as Russia, Turkey, and most surprisingly, in South Korea. These individuals would work in factories during the day, and in the evening they would live in large accommodation centers where they would eat and were subjected to various forms of indoctrination. Now, although some of them, some form of religious indoctrination was provided in many cases, the single consistent factor of radicalization was the viewing of what appeared to be a single or variation of a single video. And this video purported to show Sunni Muslim women claiming to have been raped in front of their babies by Shia soldiers of the Assad regime in Syria. this feeling of indignation at an unjustifiable assault on vulnerable, defenseless women and children was the primary motivating factor. And that feeling, as you will see, and many of you will know, transcends religious, racial, and other identity criteria, and has been used by others in radicalization and other groups. Now, I don't have any evidence of who was behind the apparent consistent approach. If I were to hypothesize, then it would be those people who wanted regime change in Syria. Other publicly available information, such as that available from the British group, the Conflict Armament Research Group, showed that it took less than 10 days for a weapon that was funded and manufactured in Eastern Europe, funded by the coalition against ISIS, for a weapon to have been manufactured where major global powers were primarily from force.
To sort of engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The CDS, the Commandant, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to share my observations, reflections on this very, very important topic. Let me start with a very important concept or point raised by General Joseph, owning, developing our own narratives. Probably one of the most important concepts, but neglected in many academic, professional conversations such as this. For me, the negative portrayal of Africa, I think, begins with the wrong narrative being communicated. And unless we take ownership of that, unless we tell our own stories, unless we develop our own narratives, if you rely on narratives developed by others, we won't find information justice. I think, again, I completely agree with General Joseph when he said we shouldn't blame other external actors, rather we should blame ourselves because we haven't done our assignment. I think it is Chinua Achebe who rightly pointed out the story of a lion would be told by the hunter or the killer until the lion is taught to tell its own stories. Ladies and gentlemen, unless we start telling our own stories will be told by others. When they do so, they frame Africa the way they want it. Narratives define us. Narratives divide us. Narratives unite us. So I think this kind of important conversation should begin from that. With that background, let me share my own comment or reflection on this important topic. Let me share this story from Ethiopia. When I grew up, we used to see and hear news about Muslims contributing money for the construction of churches, Christians contributing money for the construction of mosques. If you go to Addis Ababa, the capital, the Grand Mosque is next to the Orthodox Church. This symbolizes the peaceful coexistence between these two major Abrahamic religion followers. Fast forward to today, we hear news about the opposite, meaning the burning of churches and mosques in some places. This is a country which is described by Prophet Muhammad as a land of justice led by a just king. Now, how did we get to this point? What has changed? A lot has changed, but I would like to focus on something which is in line with the theme of this conference, which is youth radicalization. First, let me share this definition with you because I believe this definition gives us the context for our conversation. So the 2015 UNDP report defined radicalization as a process marked by a departure from generally accepted social norms and values. I would like to underscore on this. Departure from generally accepted social norms and values. The objective of those using radicalization as a tool is to pressure others to subscribe to their ideology, whatever that ideology can be. So in this definition, based on this definition, we can see that there is Islamic Muslim extremism and Christian extremism, which includes what General Joseph and Ms. Tolo mentioned earlier. This is an inclusive, comprehensive definition, which includes any form of extremism, which is a departure from acceptable norms and values in a given society. So based on this definition, we can also make a brief few comments. As we all know, and as the previous speakers rightly articulated, while globally the likelihood of extremist violence, like the 9/11 attacks, has decreased, local and regional radicalization are on the rise. The UNDP report indicates that high-profile attacks, such as the abduction of 276 girls in Nigeria in 2014, the beheading of 21 Coptic Christian migrant workers in Libya in February 2015, the murder of 147 students in Kenya in April 2015, and the Boko Haram attacks in northern Cameroon are just a few examples of the atrocities committed by these radical groups. According to the Global Terrorism Index 2024 report, the epicenter of terrorism has shifted out of the Middle East and into the Central Sahara region of Sub-Saharan Africa, which now accounts for over half of all deaths from terrorism. Considering this context, it is crucial to explore the causes and ways of countering radicalization. The previous speakers have clearly listed down, articulated, discussed the various drivers of these radicalism. So I'm not going to repeat those points. Rather, I will focus on some of the ways of countering radicalism. So any attempt to sustainably reduce radicalization and subsequent violence must first take into account the root causes. From that perspective, some preventive measures include community engagement, building trust between law enforcement and the community, education, raising awareness, creating an inclusive political culture, and making the youth part of the decision-making process. But most importantly, creating employment opportunities, introducing and expanding after-school programs, and collaboration with the tech industry. Of all these, again, I'll focus only on two: collaboration with tech companies, especially social media platform providers, can be an excellent and effective strategy to counter online radicalization and violent extremism. One approach to tackling radicalization on social media is by mitigating the formation of echo chambers. Often, the early stages of radicalization are reinforced by a one-sided, even false information. A 2019 PBS interview with the University of Pennsylvania researcher explored how social media algorithms can exacerbate this phenomenon by continually providing users with just as, or at times, even more extreme content. Thus, one creative approach could be tweaking these algorithms to provide users with more diverse perspective. Closely monitoring the online space for signs of radicalization is another step in the right direction. A few years ago, I was involved in a collaborative project between my former institution, Addis Ababa University, and Oxford University in the UK. The main goal of the project was to understand and address growing concerns about the possible use of social media content in inciting hatred and violence. The study provided a very strong empirical base to understand how prevalent the most extreme forms of expression are among conversations in social media space. One takeaway point of the finding was that a regular monitoring of trends and patterns of hate speech on social media can help stakeholders such as government agencies to identify and counter contents which promote extremism. A potential opportunity for this work was included in a 2017 UNESCO report on social media role in youth radicalization. So this shift in communication strategy presents an opportunity for tech companies to reduce radicalization on their platform by removing these videos and mitigating recruitment efforts. One should not be naive about possible pushback from some organizations such as human rights groups, which might criticize a potential collaboration between government agencies and social media platform providers on the assumption that such collaborations would erode people's right to express their views without fear. On the surface, this concern appears to be legitimate. The central argument and evidence for the proponents of this position is Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states everyone has a right to freedom of opinion and expression. These rights include freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. However, on the flip side of Article 19, we have Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which states the following. Any propaganda for war shall be prohibited by law. Any advocacy of national, racial, religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. Given the essence of Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it is incumbent on all stakeholders to collaborate and respond to radicalization in a very strategic and coordinated manner. Effective collaboration with the tech industry will help governments to both proactively counter violent extremism as well as hold those behind radicalization responsible. Education can be another effective tool to counter radicalization. Some of the most vulnerable groups to radicalization might be those who either lack proper education or have been the product of a flawed curriculum, particularly in areas such as history, media literacy, etc. While exploring various approaches to counter radicalization, one should consider the role of education in responding to radicalization. On this note, Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani Nobel Peace Prize winner and human rights advocate, said the following: with bombs, you can kill terrorists. With books, you can kill terrorism and radicalism. I agree with her. Bombs can kill terrorists or the victims of actors of extremism. However, education can kill the ideology. We can only create long-lasting solutions through prevention efforts like education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bayene, for those comments and remarks and observations. Ladies and gentlemen, you've had a lot to listen to, and of course, you had a rich tapestry from our presenters, thinkers, and actually, I think now it's time for you to sort of be engaged with this conversation. As I said at the beginning, it's a tough one, but a critical one for our continent. So I'm hoping that with the team of experts that we have here, that you'll be able to sort of have some questions, and maybe they will also help us understand any points that, or clarify any points that may not have been clear in their own presentations. We are going to sort of, I think the usual way, put your hand up, and you might be directing a question to the panel, but on the other hand, you may just decide that actually it's to a particular presenter, given what they have said. So without further ado, the floor is yours, and we wait to see if there's any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Moderator. I like the topic of contemporary security challenges.
Could you introduce yourself, sir?
I like that. Sorry.
It would just be helpful to everybody to know who's speaking. Thank you.
I'm Major General retired Richard Ruthateno.
Thank you, sir.
On Rwanda Defense Forces. Let me thank first the panelists for the brilliant discussions. Let me thank also the RDF Command Staff College for organizing this symposium. And this theme of contemporary security challenges, the African perspective. I like the African perspective part of it. My question will be to Ms. Akelele, but all panelists can answer the questions. You talked about, you mentioned about one of the strands of the UK counter-terrorism strategy of PREVENT. I fully recognize the role of definitely governance in Africa as one of the fuels for radicalization. However, I remember another strand, I also trained in the UK in that counterterrorism of PURSUE. Now, these terrorists definitely are sponsored. They are armed, they are financed, and definitely they have a base, they are somewhere. And definitely the sponsors are well known. Now, my question is, what's the role of African Union in pursuing the sponsors? These who are sponsoring them, the financiers, those who are arming them. What is the role of African Union member states? Because definitely they are sponsored by some African member states, or even non-state actors, but based in Africa. I wouldn't wish to talk outside Africa. I'll come back to that. I've seen recently, they mentioned about Eastern Congo. we have FDLR, which are it's a recognized terrorist group. You'll find some member states actually coming to ally with it. And you find African Union is quiet about it. So what's wrong? Is African Union failing or what's going on?
Okay, thank you.
My second question is about, everybody talked about their narrative, changing the narrative, owning the narrative, and the global north. Now, my submission is, whatever the global north does, actually they are doing the right thing for themselves. Right from slavery, I think General Joseph talked about slavery, about so many things the global north has been doing. They do everything in their own interests. If Africa cannot define their interests, defend their interests and protect them, then the North will always dictate and pursue their own interests. Because I believe whatever they are doing it in their own interests. So if Africa thinks that the North, the global North will come and whatever they are doing will be doing in the African interests, then we are wrong. That's why we need to change that narrative. And we need to understand that in as long as African countries fail to define their interests, then protect and defend them, then we shall always have this problem. We can never blame the North for all our problems. They are pursuing their interests, and they have the right to pursue their interests. And as long as we remain unable to define and protect and defend our own interests. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think the first question, Tolu, if you take that. I think the second one was more of a comment on what has been said. Tolu, do you want to sort of respond to that and
Sure.
as quickly and as short as possible so we can get some more questions? Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great question. And I think not only the African Union, but we see this with ECOWAS in certain shortcomings in attacking the root problem. However, I do think if we're talking about the financing of terrorism, I think it's less of an onus on the African Union, but more counter-terrorist financing, following the money. And we do see a lot of financial entities in Nigeria, EFCC, they take precedent and they're the ones who are more skilled in that regard. I do, however, think there is a responsibility for the African Union and ECOWAS and more collaborative cross-border counter-terrorist financing initiatives. And I think that's something that needs to be developed on. But I think that AU is quiet because I think they focus more on trade and more overarching strategic visions as opposed to some of these counter-terrorist financing initiatives that should be at the forefront of discussions. I think governments as well have to take responsibility because in some cases the sponsorship does come from within the country, within certain members of government who want to fuel the conflict because it is a money-making endeavor to continue the existence of certain insurgencies. So again, you can receive foreign donations or arms deals, and again, that money kind of goes under the table, and sometimes the arms end up in the hands of the insurgents themselves. So I think there's a lot, it's a very good question, but it's quite tricky to answer succinctly. But I do think more counter-terrorist financing initiatives from overarching unions like the AU and more cross-border collaborative, intentional fighting and following the money from the likes of ECOWAS. But I think, again, we're seeing there are some issues between and amongst nation states which makes these kind of collaborative endeavors quite difficult. I did have just a quick comment on changing the narrative. And I think the reason why it's so difficult for Africans to change the narrative that the West or others have placed upon Africa as being insecure, inherently dangerous, etc., and a hotbed of extremism, I think the shifting of that narrative is coming from the youth. But if the youth are suppressed and their voices aren't heard, it's very difficult to change that narrative. So what we're seeing is there's no intention from certain corrupt leaders to change that narrative because it's not in their best interest. So I think that's why we're seeing a bit of push-pull and difficulty in changing that narrative, because if you meet any Nigerian youth or the majority of African youth, they're brilliant, they're excellent, they go abroad and they excel. And people don't meet them and think, oh, how are you excelling when you've come from Nigeria or wherever you've come from? They just see them as they are. So I think the more the youth has a voice, the more we can see a shift in that narrative. But I'll let my other panelists answer that second question.
Okay. Is there any other question at the moment? Let's see. Excuse me, there's a gentleman around there, yeah. And then behind you, yes, please, yes.
Thank you. I am called Brigadier General Dr. Emmanuel Shirinji. I'm the Defense Advisor, Uganda High Commission, Kigali. I really, first of all, thank you, the panelists, for the rich insight you bring to us about this subject of radicalization and extremism. Mine is, I have three issues to address, and the first one looks more of an observation, but can also lead to a discussion that can also generate questions. And it's about the issue of the causes or the breeding ground of radicalization. The causes are spelled out, really cut across all communities, poor, rich, or regions. Actually, until you eventually came in the discussion, I was getting an impression that it's maybe shifting more into the Muslim community. But it really cuts across. And so my observation is that we need to see how to look into this issue of radicalization, how to package it, so that down the road we don't miss or create gaps in the way it is understood, not only at the African level, but also African continental level, but also at the global level. The second one is the issue of African, maybe this one will go to Dr. Ashraf. You stated that African countries lack the capability to counter terrorism. Fine, let's accept it. But at the same time, where we have had the intervening players coming in, there has been no results, positive results still. And this, after a long time, that's why you see discontent, discomfort of the players in the Sahel region saying, no, I think you're not helping us, get out. So I don't want us to look at it as a blame game. You know, Africans have failed, but also the players also that have come in with the requisite technology haven't really also, we have not seen the results. So maybe you need to expand on that. Then the third quick one is the issue of the narrative, the African narrative. Is it going to be the issue of more said, it's easier said than done? We need to start and generate it. Maybe my simple suggestion is maybe to look at this honorable symposium, generating proposals that we can start at A level. Of course, these are strategic issues, which in my own thinking is that they can be generated starting from the African Union, the leadership, the strategic leadership level. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think most of those were comments rather than sort of direct questions, so we'll take them as that. Now, on this side, there's a sort of gentleman here in the front, and then behind, and then I'll come back to this side of the hall. Yes, sure. So what was it? Well, the question to Mr. Ashraf. Sorry, give me a second. I thought it was a comment of what you said. Dr. Ashraf, do you want to sort of address that briefly?
Yes, thank you. I think that I should have used the word believe when I said African countries might believe that they lack the capability. And certainly in areas such as technology, we mentioned, there is a case for that. And I'm not suggesting, and I did reinforce the fact that one should, wherever possible, take advantage of help wherever it comes from, the West, if that's where it needs to come from. And I would not suggest that there is a blame game here. What you've quite rightly reinforced is the observation that is being made by many African countries, and that is that stationing troops from foreign countries on the ground is counterproductive. And often it not only fails to achieve the aim of counterterrorism, but it does increase it. And let me link to the issue of narratives. You see, radicalization and narratives is something that I was involved with, both academically and for government, 25 years ago. And this debate that you're having here is not entirely new. It's the debate that started in the West, and it's areas that have not been adequately reserved. Narratives are not very effective, particularly against people whose world experience is contrary to whatever narrative you put across. Taulu gave a quote from one of the terrorist group leaders as to why they do what they do. It was much more clearly encapsulated by Osama bin Laden 2 decades earlier, when he said to the West, "We fight you because you occupy our land and you steal our wealth." And that quote, 25 years later, is essentially the same thing. And the narrative that you produce, or anybody tries to produce, has to deal with the sense of grievance, and that sense of grievance is based around social, political, and economic injustices in society. If you eliminate those, then you have a counter-narrative, a very effective counter-narrative. So I hope that I've done some justice to your question, and forgive me if I failed to answer any elements of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ashraf. Yes, sorry, sir, right here.
Let me express myself in French.
Is the microphone on, please?
Microphone. Allô? Oui. Ouais. Excusez-moi de m'exprimer en français.
Okay.
Je me présente, je m'appelle Yaya Doukouré, je suis l'ambassadeur du Mali à Kigali. Donc, je remercie les panélistes pour la qualité de leurs interventions. Monsieur le modérateur, dans votre propos introductif, vous avez indiqué que le Sahara est l'épicentre du terrorisme, et cela est une réalité. Mais posons-nous la question pourquoi. Et depuis un certain temps, en 2011,
why? Well, since 2011, the Sahel and Sahara region
de la part de groupes terroristes
were invaded by a number of terrorist groups from Libya down to the Sahel, following the ill-considered geopolitical-based invasion of Libya. And that has led to a proliferation of terrorist groups. Now, the country that I represent was a victim of this aggression. We're coming out of a multidimensional crisis, which includes terrorism and proliferation of terrorism. Now, Madam Tulu, you're right. You're right to say about what you said about violent terrorism. You are right. And this has to be said, because the terrorists and violent extremists are born or come from a lot of people who are frustrated. multidimensional and multi-decade frustrations of the people who then, are available for manipulation. I think this is the thing that really we must discuss. We should say never again, because also now never again applies more to Libya. In the invention and destruction of Libya. And countries did what they could. Africans did what they could to stop Western countries from invading and destroying Libya. It didn't work. Now, this was the source of all those evils. There are also a number of UN resolutions. For example, the resolution of 73. This resolution was ignored. It hadn't been ignored, we wouldn't be where we are now. So, resolutions and decisions should also be respected. A third point, in Middle East and the Far East, terrorism. Well, this is also a very interesting point. I think there was a mobilization in the world coalition, international coalition against Daesh, but nobody mobilizes for Sahel, as they did for the Middle East. We should talk about this also. Another point, a lot of bombing in Afghanistan by the US. To change, to regime change and change the life there, of the outlook of social life, their culture. It didn't work. It only spread terrorism. Madam, you are right, what you said about the African Union, but we also know that there were people from those countries, Middle East and Far East, who came to help those terrorists that are now active in the Sahel, those from Libya. So this is a big problem. But I think we should reflect on this. Sometimes you don't really analyze terrorism properly. We don't have the right approach and the right outlook, and therefore the wrong approach. But I think people are beginning to think whether terrorism is not really a tool for political intervention. For example, to punish countries that want to be rid of Western pressures and Western control. We should think of that. Isn't it part of the problem of the countries that want to be free, that want to liberate themselves from, the control from Western countries, neo-colonialists and others? Are these countries not being targeted, or at least are their problems just being exacerbated on purpose by terrorism? Because we shouldn't continue with the narrative that, these are jihadists and terrorists. There's also narco trafficking, drug trafficking. And you see, for example, if you say jihadi and you are a Muslim, in a Muslim environment, jihadi is a positive struggle. So if you use this word, then you give the impression that is the Muslims who are always talking about jihadi, this is them. But in fact, it isn't. There are terrorists who are not even Muslims everywhere. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Comment, especially on the Sahel sort of situation. Does anybody want to sort of respond to sort of, it was a rather wide expose, but does the panelist, Tolu, or anybody want to sort of respond to some of the points raised?
Oui, en fait, donc, vous avez tout à fait raison.
Okay.
Il y a, dans une certaine manière, il y a un jeu géopolitique, qui...
What you said, sir. I think there is a geopolitical consideration that we must also bring in. I'm not denying that. But you see, there are quite a number of things that exacerbate the terrorist problem. Geopolitics, geopolitical struggles. But there is also corruption. But there is also, in third place, various other national or regional problems or problems that find their root somewhere else, something that is exacerbated by one of those things you mentioned. So you see, it's not just one source, one root, or one cause. What I think is that we should start where we are now. Cooperate and collaborate with those who want to help you. In the meantime, educate our people, inform, open their eyes. So it's a multilateral approach, if you see what I mean. That's all I can say on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to make a brief comment and respond to your point about mobilization for the Sahel and Iraq. You make a very valid observation that I think we all agree with about the multidimensional and multi-generational crisis which that part of the world has been facing and dealing with, and the complexities of geopolitics related to Libya and other issues as well. There's one fundamental difference, however, I think, in the approach when you look at Iraq and the emergence of Daesh and the international coalition that formed to tackle that, and the situation in the Sahel. Firstly, in Iraq, you had a request coming from the government of Iraq, which had just gone through an election and had included all components of Iraqi society to form that coalition in assistance of its efforts to deal with the threat that had emerged in the north. In the Sahel, you have a complexity of different countries and regimes and governments, and there's no single direction, if you wish, in terms of the local impetus for such an effort. There's more of a pick and choose approach, if I can use that term, that doesn't prove to be effective for now. It may be effective, we don't know. We see, for example, it's still very early to say whether what is happening between, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso will be more effective in tackling the threat than previous presence of international French-American troops. It's early to say that. However, what is clearly necessary is an effort from the local authorities and governments to address the root causes of this frustration that breeds radicalization on the ground and creates opportunity for people to develop. Because if you look at the situation in Iraq now, again, with all caveats about how difficult it is there, Anbar, which was the hotbed of Al-Qaeda for many, many years, is now one of the most fastly developing provinces with the greatest sense of security in the country, again, compared to what it was in the past, far from being perfect. But we need to see that common message and common approach, not just from the outside in, but from the inside out, in order to be able to match an effort, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, there's a group that we haven't heard from, the students. You see, there's been a lot of the top bods, but what about the students? Are there any questions from the students? Because of course, they must also be given up. There's one just over there, and from the students, okay, we'll take that one, and then one there, okay? We'll take that one first, and then from the okay. Students. Not sure about that, sir.
Thank
so
you.
Go on, yeah, please.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Rwanda Defense Force. I am a student from Rwanda Defense Force Command and Staff College. My question goes to Ms. Tulo. In her excellent presentation, she mentioned that the global terrorism activities surged 2,000% in the last 15 years. When you look back in those days, 15 years ago takes us to 2009. Before that, we had the Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. Later on, 2 years later, we had the Iraq War. And later on, those years later on, we had those surging of the activities of terrorism and radicalization. My question is, how is the geopolitical influence by Western powers with their narrative of one shoe fits all contribute to the radicalization of the youth in Africa? Having that in mind, we can see that from Afghanistan to the Middle East, now the radicalization went to the Sahara Belt. How is that related to the ideology of the western or the northern part of our continent? Thank you.
As quickly as possible.
Yes, I will. That's a great question.
We've got a pressure of time.
Just to clarify, the 2,000% increase was in the Sahel region, not worldwide. And I think, just to quickly answer that, we shouldn't look at it as the Sahel or Sub-Saharan Africa being a hotbed of Islamic extremism, but the driver is really it being a hotbed of Islamic moderation. So I think because of how the West and Western influences have been a massive part of Africa's growth, so to speak, in terms of modernity. And I don't mean, obviously, pre-colonialism. There was trade routes, and there was a lot of development across West Africa, the Sahel, Northern Africa. But in terms of culture, there has been a Western injection of culture, which has seemingly diluted or, for the purpose of radical extremist narrative, has diluted this Islamic culture within these countries. So I think that, for me, would be the shift over time. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. There was a question. Yeah, please. If you can keep it short and to the point.
Thank you, moderator, Mr. Joel. I'm Major Monyo from Tanzania Defense Forces. My question relates to radicalization and extremism with the dark web, because most of the time we normally focus on the surface, social media, and forget about the dark web. Literature shows that dark web is also promoting radicalization and extremism, and it has become somehow difficult for many governments to respond to that challenge. Simply because dark web fundamentally is focused on anonymity of the users in terms of hiding their identity and location. So how can African countries respond to the challenges posed by the dark web in promoting youth radicalization and extremism in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ashraf, I think this one's more or less directed to you.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. To put that into perspective, forget the dark web. Think back 20, 25 years ago when Al-Qaeda began to put its stuff out on web pages. Al-Qaeda would announce that it's about to make a statement. The intelligence services of the United States, the UK, which are awesome in their ability to control the World Wide Web, failed on almost every occasion to prevent the publication of those statements, that radicalization material. I think trying to fight a battle which you really cannot win is not the right approach. The dark web, the internet, social media, all of these are conduits for communication. What you have to have is a means of inoculating the recipients, the potential recipients, against the messages of hate, against the messages of mobilization, and against the messages that are required for terrorism. Yes, there is a lot being done to make life difficult for them, and the African countries should continue to do the best they can. And there are ways, technically, to perhaps not stop what's going on in the dark web, but to prevent it being, if you like, used on people's computers and their phones. And I don't think it's worth going into detail. If you want to, I'm sure you can find the relevant detail. But my advice is that you don't fight an absolute battle. You can't do that. And it links to the point that I think was made earlier about the experience of Afghanistan and Iraq, where I was involved on the ground with the forces. How does that affect what's going on in the Sahel? In one word, it's very powerful. And that word is success. It's the belief that you can win that changes your ability to deploy. And what, sadly, these terrorist groups demonstrated in Iraq, in Afghanistan, was that ultimately they will regain power. What they demonstrated in Iraq was that they could fight and overcome a military force that had been trained by no less than General Petraeus and been equipped by American weapons. And it crumbled within hours. And it crumbled within hours not because it didn't have the training, not because it didn't have the weapons, but because it didn't have the belief in the will to fight and win. The terrorists have the belief through those experiences to win. And that is the greatest threat. And that is why whatever strategy and policy you adopt has to lead to success. That is the only way to destroy that the most powerful incentive in warfare. And the Rwandan army is an excellent example of how you can overcome huge odds in terms of weaponry, in terms of training, in terms of support, in terms of numbers, by having that will to win.
Thank you, Dr. Ashraf. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've been beaten by that old enemy of all of us, that thing called time. And I wouldn't want to be the one to stand between you and lunch. And so without further ado, please, I'd like you to join me in sort of thanking what I think has been a stellar panel. And I hopefully, you've learned something from some of their presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, the panel. I think many of them are still around, so please don't hesitate to engage with them in the corridors over the next couple of days on any points that you might have wanted to raise. But as for me, thank you very much for allowing me to host this first session, and to all of you, and I wish you the best over the next 2 to 3 days of deliberations. I'm Joel Kibazo. Thank you, and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Joel and the panel, for this excellent session. The next item on the program is lunch, to be moderated by our protocol team this time. And we have 2 restaurants. The first restaurant is Fellini.
Maze kubikurikira hariho ikiganiro kiri kugirwamo uruhare na bamwe mu bayobozi ndetse n'abashakashatsi nararibonye ndetse n'abandi babarizwa mu rwego rw'umutekano hano ku mugabane wa Afurika ndetse no hanze yawo. Ikindi kandi iki kiganiro cyagarutse ku ruhare rw'urubyiruko, kumva neza uruhare rw'urubyiruko mu kubaka amahoro n'umutekano, mu kubaka igihugu, mu kubaka ubudaheranwa bw'igihugu cyabo, cyane cyane hano ku mugabane wa Afurika. Kimwe mu byagaragajwe kuri uyu mugabane, habarizwa urubyiruko rwinshi rwishora mu bikorwa birimo iby'umutekano muke, mu bikorwa by'urugomo ndetse n'ibindi bishamikiye ku iterabwoba. Kimwe mu byagaragajwe rero cyaba nk'igisubizo kuri uyu mugabane wa Afurika ndetse no kuri urwo rubyiruko n'ubufatanye n'inzego za leta ndetse n'abandi mu rwego rwo